Welcome to Chewin Glass, the podcast. I'm your host, Brett Wade. Hi, my name is Brett Wade. Thank you for your curiosity and interest in checking out my podcast. I know that there are a lot of self-help podcasts out there, not to mention the myriad of blogs, vlogs, videos, and various experts and influencers doing their thing. Right off the top, you might be wondering two things. Number one, what the heck is with this title, Chewin Glass? And two, with all the other podcasts out there, why should you spend your valuable time listening to what myself or my guests have to say? Well, firstly, let's address the title, Chewin Glass. This is a metaphor. This metaphor describes an acute mental or emotional state that I often experience during times of significant stress. I started to use the metaphor several years ago to try and describe my surly mood to my wife. She would often say, "You have that look again, what's happening?" After either deflecting or uttering some unintelligible noises, I was finally able to articulate the feeling that seemed to best describe what I was going through. I would say, "I feel like I want to chew some glass." You can imagine the look of horror on her face. Once she realized that I wasn't actually serious, but rather it was a metaphor to describe my current emotional and mental state, and I knew of the requisite solution, which I remembered to be a dramatic need to introduce a physical challenge to my body. Once I explained this to her, the pallor was quickly replaced by her normal glow. I'll talk about my history in a moment and how I became known as a glass chewer, but I'll tell you now that it was about the time I was a teenager that I first started to encounter these strong mental and emotional challenges. It was also about the time I discovered that intense physical exercise was the salve for my emotions. Like all lived lives, my life has had its shares of ups and downs. I've had periods of my life when I forgot the solution to the feelings of chewing glass were physical in nature, and instead, I reached for something far less healthful. These periods would lead me down some darker pathways. Eventually, I'd remember that physical practice was the way out. Over the years, I've added a regular meditation practice and yoga to assist with these feelings of needing to chew glass. I find these more subtle practices to be prophylactic or mitigating, whereas intense physical exercise has been, for me, the immediate solution to the problem. Now when my wife sees me and notices that I'm having a difficult day, she simply says, "Looks like you're about to chew some glass." I nod, and she reminds me to head to the gym or grab my running shoes and get outside. Over the years, I've met many other glass chewers. Just go to any triathlon club, running club, cross-training session, fitness center, hot yoga class, gym, and you'll meet other glass chewers. In fact, over the years I've asked people if they know what I mean when I say, if I don't exercise, I feel like I need to chew glass. Without fail, these people nod their heads and know exactly what I mean. I've become quite good at picking these people out in any crowd. Maybe this even sounds like you. If so, don't worry, this is a very big community. I hope this podcast will introduce you to some interesting characters who are also, as I call them, glass chewers. I hope you will find their stories inspiring and helpful. You will see, if nothing else, that you are not alone. And as far as I'm aware, no one who ever uses this phrase or intuits the phrase has actually ever seriously considered or done such an insane act as chewing glass. On that note, before I go any further, the important disclaimer. Just to be 100% clear, I am not, have not, and would never actually advocate chewing glass. This is obviously a very dangerous act. You need to fully understand that I only use the phrase as a dramatic metaphor, which helps to describe my complex emotional and mental states, and acts as a cognitive stimulus for immediate, positive, physical solution for me. By using the phrase chewing glass, it conjures up strong multi-sensory imagery, which I then use as a catalyst to get me to do some physical exercise. This, you could look at it, is my own version of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it seems to work quite well for me. If you are considering taking this phrase as a literal approach to your current mental health state, please seek professional help immediately. I'm being very serious here. I've never actually wanted to do self-harm like chewing glass or cutting, or even had suicidal ideations. I know that mental health is nothing to joke about. If you are having ideas of self-harm, please seek help immediately. I'll put a mental health support link on this podcast for both Canada and the United States. But right now, in the United States, if you are experiencing significant mental health problems or challenges or suicidal thoughts, in the United States, the number is 1-800-273-TALK, or visit mentalhealth.gov. In Canada, the number is 1-833-456-4566, or visit canada.ca. On the final note of the title Chewing Glass, to avoid confusion or association with other serious conditions, I am aware that there's a disorder called pica, or some people call it pica. This is a disorder, an eating disorder, where people ingest a wide range of objects generally not considered to be food. It is obvious and hopeful that this podcast has nothing to do with pica or pica disorder, and once again, if you are inclined to eat or swallow things that might be dangerous, please seek medical attention. Okay, that's the disclaimers and clarifiers out of the way. Hopefully now you have some more clarity on why I use the metaphor chewing glass, and how I use it as a cognitive behavioral tool to motivate me towards my immediate solution of using exercise to change my acute and emotional state. While the metaphor may not be exactly what you would use, I'm sure through this podcast you will find some of my guest stories helpful and maybe quite relatable. For some of my guests, they will have their own strategies to deal with their acute mental or emotional state. Some of their strategies may be much less physical in nature, maybe more spiritual or mental, or perhaps just something more gentle. My goal is to interview a wide variety of glass chewers. My intention with this podcast is to provide listeners with tips, tools, strategies, and stories to help with the inevitable vicissitudes of life. Now, you might be wondering, what are my credentials to host such a podcast which deals with subjects and strategies related to mental health, physical health, emotional health, and spiritual health? I will detail my bio more in just a moment, but the short answer to that question is that I do not consider myself an expert in any one area, except in the experience of my own life. I have a very diverse professional and academic background with several degrees and careers ranging from physiotherapist to college professor to researcher to writer to entrepreneur to yoga and meditation teacher. I'm currently in the 5th decade of my life, and I now see my dharma or purpose to assist others in their journey as I simultaneously continue to help develop my own. I, by no means, have got this thing called life figured out. But as a student of life, I've figured out a few things that may be of benefit to some people. If I can't be of service to you, perhaps some of my guests can be through their own stories, their own anecdotes. I should also mention that before I became aware that other people not only resonated with the phrase chewing glass, I naively thought I was the first person to have ever used this phrase out loud. It turns out that many people have actually had dreams of chewing glass or eating glass. I came across a few dream interpretations on websites on the internet. While these interpretations vary, they do have in common that something is not right and requires immediate action. And this is true of just about all the dream interpretations that I looked at for chewing glass. Okay, now onto the bio. So how did things begin for this glass chewer? I would describe my childhood as relatively uneventful. Of course, that's never actually a true statement for anybody's childhood, but for the purposes of this introduction for this podcast, it obviates the potential for me to bore you with seemingly insignificant details. I do actually think my childhood was close to idyllic. I grew up in a small village of about 1,600 people in the southern interior of British Columbia. I was painfully shy, but fortunate to have some very close friends to help ease and share the pains of adolescent development and some inevitable bullying that goes along with that period. My parents both worked, so my sister and I were typical latchkey kids of the 70s. I have very fond memories of camping and trips to Disneyland, but most of all, I remember spending time with my friends. Of my surviving friends that I grew up with, I'm still very close with them to this day. Elementary school, like all the grades, can be tough, especially when you're a shy introvert. The only people I really talked to were my very few close friends. I liked school well enough, but I suppose like most boys of my generation, I really liked lunch and recess. I don't have a lot of memories from those first few years of elementary school, but as it relates to this podcast, I can recall my first kiss, my first heartbreak, my first fight, and discovering running. Almost all the boys in my village played sports. My mom was a jock and loved baseball, so I was put into baseball, soccer, hockey, and pretty much every imaginable team sport. I detested them all. Sorry, Mom. In fact, the only part of those sports that I liked was either running or skating by myself. I never actually wanted to touch the ball or the puck. I just liked to move. If you're getting some image in your mind of me as a skinny, attention deficit prone kid, you have the wrong image. I was quiet, chubby, back then we were called husky, kid who just liked to run and skate. I was not fast, but I learned quickly that running and my love for riding my bike could set me free. I was in my own little world, riding my bike or jogging at lunch, and while I wasn't yet to become svelte, I was able to forget about being ridiculed or bullied and just process my emotions through sweat. By the time I reached junior high, I was still a little bit husky, but deepening my love for running and riding a bike. I was still slow, but it felt good to be out there and just sweating on my own. The mild bullying continued, but now my mom had finally agreed to let me quit all those sports that I just hated so much: soccer, hockey, and baseball. There was less opportunity for taunting by testosterone-fueled teenage boys. Although I experienced enough trauma to last a lifetime, from the mandatory showers after PE class to keep a psychologist permanently employed just by me. By the time grade 9 came along, I was in my first relationship. My girlfriend was smart and kind, and she seemed to like me. I was an emotionally stunted and clumsy boyfriend, but she supported me through it. Through her, I learned that I was not very good at being a supportive boyfriend, and I also learned that I was really not doing well in school. I think I was so anxious in school that by the time I actually got to chemistry class in grade 9, I realized that I had no idea what was going on. The same happened to be true for all my classes. I somehow passed grade 9 in no small part to the help from my very smart girlfriend. Going into the summer between grade 9 and grade 10, I was starting to get a little more fit. The husky was not yet a greyhound, but I had lost some weight and I was getting faster. I was entering 10-kilometer races and not finishing last, close, but not last. The physical results were intoxicating. I doubled down on my efforts and in a messy and immature way broke up with my girlfriend and invested all my efforts into myself. I was feeling more confidence and certainly noticeably less ridiculed and less bullied, less taunted. I entered my first triathlon that summer. The year was 1986. Triathlon at that time was an obscure and little-known sport. I could swim well enough, and I assumed my passion for biking and my recent success found with running would propel me to great heights. It did not have that immediate effect. I managed to survive that first triathlon, and it would become my first watershed moment. By the time I got to high school, I was visibly much slimmer. High school was an amalgamation from many surrounding towns, so most people did not know Husky Brett. They only knew me as the running and triathlon-obsessed nerd. I was fine with that, And by nerd, I certainly don't mean that I suddenly was also doing much better in school. Unfortunately, those deficits of knowledge from junior high followed me, and now I was without my smart girlfriend. I decided to put the same effort into school as I was for training for triathlons and hoped that it would get me caught up, but it did not. While those skills would later pay off academically, I was destined to barely scrape by in high school too. Besides training in the 3 disciplines of swimming, cycling, and running every day, I was working part-time and I was on the cross-country running team. I was still very close to my same friends, but they, understandably, could not quite relate to what I was doing. As I approached grade 12, I had a couple more relationships, but mostly I was focused on triathlons. As the popularity of the sport grew, so did more events, and entering into my consciousness was the Ironman triathlon. With 2.4 miles of swimming, 112 miles of biking, and 26.2 miles of running, all at once, this was a much bigger challenge than the smaller Olympic distance triathlons I had been doing. Fortunately for me, I had a local mentor, who also happened to be my boss. He was the owner of a bike shop where I had worked. He had done the Ironman in Penticton, Canada a couple of times and was a bit of a local legend. He'd finished as a top Canadian once and won several smaller triathlons in Canada and the United States. Mental note, Brett. Get him on this podcast. I did not need a lot of encouragement to sign up for the Ironman, but the reassurance from this guy that I could do it and he would guide me through the immense training required added to my confidence. I was all in. It was the summer of 1989. I was 19 years old, and I was at the start line of Ironman Canada. Even now, it would be a bit uncommon for a teenager to do the Ironman. Back then, I was a real rarity. I finished the Ironman in a respectable time of 11 hours and 35 minutes. It was, by far, the most physically, mentally, emotionally demanding thing I'd ever done. I really suffered. At times, I was barely walking in the final 13 miles of the marathon. I will never forget that feeling of complete and utter exhaustion. I also remember at the finish line my uncle saying to me as we were chatting, "Brett, I don't even think I've been awake for 11 hours. I laughed and I cried, and I laughed and I cried, and I laughed and I cried, and I did that uncontrollably for hours later, even while trying to sleep. Once I returned home and discovered from the Ironman that I had some ability to be successful, I was back to training. I was also in a serious relationship and beginning to think about not only doing the Ironman again, but thinking about my future. I decided to give college a try. I was enjoying increased responsibilities at the bike shop and was even considering purchasing a franchise. I thought I'd better take some business courses, so I signed up to go to college. I really enjoyed being around other students. The college life was so different. Nobody cared whether you went to school or not, and all of my classes allowed me a lot of freedom, so I trained a lot. I was determined to qualify for the World Championships in Hawaii that year. I began to repeat a similar pattern to what I did in high school. I trained a lot, I worked a bit, I didn't put much effort into school. That quote by Einstein comes to mind. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, I was getting the results. I was getting faster, fitter, but school was not going well. I dropped out of school. Well, more accurately put, I was failing in business school so badly I was embarrassed to show my face. The added time of not going to college, though, allowed me to squeeze in more training, and that paid off. In August of 1990, I completed my second Ironman at the ripe age of 20, and I achieved my goal of qualifying for the World Championships in Hawaii that October. When I crossed the finish line later that afternoon, I was once again absolutely shattered. I was more than 20 minutes faster than the previous year, but I did not feel much better. My girlfriend, who was there in support, looked at me like I was truly insane for doing this to myself. Once I found out that I had qualified for the race in Hawaii, I immediately accepted the offer. This act reaffirmed her belief in my level of sanity. Upon returning home from Penticton and having paid my deposit for the World Championships, which were about 6 weeks away, something happened. When I pulled into my parents' driveway and began to unload my bike and other bags, I had this very strange feeling. Of course, there was the expected sore legs and generalized fatigue, but there was something else. I put my bike in my bedroom and decided to rest for a couple of days before resuming training. Normally, a couple of days rest after some physical exhaustion was all I needed, but as I pulled on my lycra shorts and cycling shoes and headed to get my bike, I cracked. I stood there staring at my bike and tears started to flow. Tears turned into full sobs and I sank to the ground. What was wrong with me? This was so strange. I had never felt like this at any time in my life. I mean, sure, I'd had many times of sadness during my childhood, but cycling and running were always the solution. Now it seemed the bike and all the training had suddenly become just another source of sadness. This was another turning point for me. With my identity faltering and no direction now in my life, I had a few dark nights of the soul. I began to drink a lot of beer and tinker with my car and wallow in self-pity. This, by the way, the drinking, would sadly repeat itself over the years during periods of massive stress. The wallowing and the drinking went on for a couple of weeks, and thankfully, a comment from my family member about my growing beer belly snapped me out of it. Having still very raw memories of being made fun of for being a chubby kid was still an effective motivator. While triathlon seemed to be done, I could not go back to being the husky. I may not have been the greyhound anymore, but I surely was not going to tolerate being chubby again. At the last possible minute, in terms of college admission deadlines, I quickly decided to go back and give college another try. I realized business was not my thing, but clearly I had an interest in physical, human potential, and a borderline, I suppose, obsession with the human body. I enrolled in human kinetics. Back then we called it physical education. The classes were interesting, the instructors were young, passionate, and fit, and so inspiring. I loved my classes. I was doing well, and I even joined the cross-country running team at college. I'd rediscovered my passion for running, and once again it was proving to assuage my feelings of stress that would come from late nights of studying. The years of physical training had given me an unusual level of discipline that when I applied it to academics was finally working. By the time I was completing my first official year of college, I was on the President's Honor Roll and wanting more. I had one more year to complete my diploma, but I was now setting my sights on becoming a physiotherapist. I didn't know much about physiotherapy. I'd never actually been to one, although I really should have been to try to deal with all my repetitive injuries from running. As my second year of college began, I was seated next to a fit-looking guy about my age in anatomy and physiology class. I didn't recognize him from phys ed classes, so I asked him what he was studying. He explained to me that he had been applying to physiotherapy at UBC Vancouver but not been successful. He was trying to boost his GPA and make one more attempt. When I excitedly shared with him that I wanted to get into physiotherapy, he replied, "Good luck. It's very hard to get into. You have a better chance at medical school." Undeterred, I decided to take that challenge like qualifying for the World Championships. I headed straight over to the college guidance counselor's office and asked about the prerequisites and GPA for physiotherapy. The year is 1991, and there is no such thing as the internet. The counselor did not inspire confidence when he said, "Physiotherapy. I think I've heard of it." He fumbled around for the UBC paper calendar, and when he leafed through it, he informed himself that yes, indeed, there was such a program. He read aloud the GPA and academic requirements, and I thought to myself, no problem. I'm on the President's Honor Roll. I've got this. All that training and discipline had paid off. I accepted the offer from UBC School of Rehabilitation Medicine, and in the fall of 1992, I started my new academic journey. I was a small-town boy when I moved into my dorm room at UBC for the first year, and of all the things I learned in physiotherapy school, it was learning to cope with loneliness and the pressures of school that turned out to be my greatest teacher. I was doing fine academically, but I struggled severely with feeling isolated in my little dorm room, surrounded by strangers. During this stressful period when I should have been remembering what works to assist with these strong emotional feelings, exercise, I instead turned to what many university students do, drinking. I was too shy to go to the bars. This is way before smartphones and social media, so I just started buying cases of beer and drinking alone in my dorm room. Not good. Once again, this bad habit made another inebriated entrance onto my stage. Thankfully, after a few weeks of this behavior, a roommate noticed what was happening and intervened. He was a few years older than me and much, much wiser. He bluntly said, "Hey, Brett, if you're going to drink, don't do it alone." He invited me and my case of sad beer into his room. I've learned many things from this guy, and I have never had the opportunity yet to thank him, but one day I really hope to do so. The drinking lessened, and I started to make some friends in the program. I had let my running slide, but I was going to the gym regularly and lifting some weights, and that was starting to help with my mood considerably. I was still struggling with profound feelings of loneliness, but to help this, I decided to see if there was anything in the library that might be of assistance. This was another watershed moment. I took out a book on meditation. In that book, I learned a meditation that I still do to this day called Trataka. Essentially, I learned to hold the image of a flickering candle in my third eye. At first, it seemed futile, like anybody who's tried to learn meditation knows. But after a few weeks, I had this great epiphany. Even though I am alone, I do not feel lonely anymore. Game changer. Over the next few years at university, I deepened my meditation practice and rediscovered my joy of running. By my last year of university, I was running marathons again and loved the feeling that my feet could literally take me anywhere in Vancouver. I'd also started a new relationship that would once again change the course of my life. After graduation, I moved to a medium-sized town in the interior of British Columbia and started work at a private practice. It was a busy private practice, and I was thrilled to be using my training to help people with all kinds of injuries and disabilities. But after a few months, I was growing restless, and I felt I needed a change. Jobs were plentiful for physiotherapists in both the United States and Canada. I had recently rediscovered my love of skiing and found a new passion, rock climbing. One day, while flipping through a ski magazine which was featuring the ski resorts of Colorado, I was struck with the desire to move. The year was 1996, and the internet was still not a thing, at least not for me. I went to the library and got the yellow pages for Colorado, photocopied the addresses for all the physical therapy clinics in Colorado. I printed a pile of resumes, stuffed some envelopes, stamped them, took them to the post office, and waited. Boy, things are so much easier now. I eventually received an invitation to interview at a job in a small town not far from the ski resort town of Telluride, Colorado. I made arrangements for an interview, flew down, rented a car, and toured around that amazing state before my interview. It was spectacular. I accepted the offer, flew back home, packed my car with everything else I owned that I thought was important, and I moved. I loved living in Colorado. Skiing, rock climbing, mountaineering, mountain biking, camping, every weekend was packed with something. I thought, I could live here forever. But then, that familiar feeling of restlessness kicked in. After barely a year there, I parted ways with the clinic and spun the globe. My finger landed on Hawaii. I may have been peeking and controlled the spin of the globe to make sure that my finger actually landed on those islands in the middle of the South Pacific. It was a place that I just needed to visit. After passing on the World Championships a few years prior, I thought this was my second chance. The year was 1997, and I had, for the first time, a home computer and dial-up internet. It was pretty slow, but I had nothing to compare it with, and searching for clinics in Hawaii, this was certainly faster than going to the library and doing that yellow page thing again. I sent a few emails out, and within a day or two was invited out for an interview. I excitedly booked a flight to Hawaii for the weekend and went out for the interview. Having never been to Hawaii, I never really knew what to expect. As soon as we landed and I walked into the open-air airport, I couldn't believe my senses. The warm, fragrant air was intoxicating. I was met at the airport by the clinic owner, and I knew I was going to accept this job even if there was no pay. After accepting the position, I flew back to Colorado, packed everything I owned that I, again, thought was important, and moved to the Big Island. I loved the clinic where I worked. I loved the people. I loved my coworkers. I loved everything about it. My weekends were spent swimming and surfing and fishing and camping. I met so many wonderful people, and I thought, as I did in Colorado, I would stay there forever. But you get the idea. Less than 2 years after arriving in Hawaii, and not even enough time to think about doing the Ironman, I was barely running. I was leaving. I had seriously started to wonder what was wrong with me. I was recently married. I lived in the most beautiful place in the world. I had all my basic needs met, all kinds of freedom, and yet I was unhappy. When this feeling started up again in Hawaii, I had convinced myself that I must have made a bad career choice. Even as I say those words, it just makes me shake my head. Just before leaving the Big Island, I had applied to a naturopathic medical school in Arizona. After completing a few prerequisites at the University of Hawaii, I was accepted into the school in Tempe, Arizona. I'd flown down for the interview and was excited to finally, quote-unquote, do something that would make me happy. I went back to Hawaii and was preparing to pack up when I had a sobering thought. How the heck am I going to work full-time to be able to pay for this tuition and go to school full-time for 4 more years? The depression that followed that answer hit me very hard. I could see that this was not really going to work. As a last-ditch effort to make a career change to, again, find happiness, I flew back home to British Columbia and signed up to write the MCAT, the Medical College's admissions test. I was going to apply to medical school in Canada. At least the tuition would be slightly less. My partner at the time had had enough of my vacillations and mood swings, and she took a job in Pennsylvania while I stuck around in British Columbia studying for the MCAT. My deficits in chemistry and physics from not paying attention all the way back in junior high and high school were coming back to haunt me. In spite of disciplined studying for months, I just simply could not bridge that knowledge gap in time. On the eve before the exam, I sat on a rooftop in Vancouver with one of my oldest and best friends. We drank beer until sunrise. Around 6 a.m., he turned to me and said, "There is no way you're writing that exam." He was right. The next day, I was hungover and on a plane to Pennsylvania. It was only the second time that I had ever really quit something, the first being business school. I was more depressed than ever. Once again, you'd think I would remember that during times of strong emotional stress, turn to physical exercise. I did not do that. I got a job as a physical therapist in Pennsylvania and decided to stick with physiotherapy for a while. I decided that maybe graduate school would be the best path for me. After only a few months of being in Pennsylvania, I had started a master's degree in a small town at a small university in Michigan. I flew into Michigan a few times a year and stayed on campus taking advanced courses in manual therapy. I was really happy to be taking these courses. I remembered what I loved about physiotherapy. I had a job as a manager of a rehab department at a nursing home in Pennsylvania. I wasn't doing much in the way of physical activity, but certainly explored the eastern states and dealt with any lingering anxiety or depression with, wine. I made some good friends and we partied a lot. Unfortunately, this was temporarily helpful for my feeling of sadness. I say unfortunately because it reinforced that bad habit. I eventually finished my master's degree, but the job was not satisfying. I had become tired of basically firing people all of the time. And in my job as a manager, I also was selling independent living suites on the resort. I know, how the heck did I get that job? Well, that old feeling of needing to move resurfaced and we packed up everything. By this time we were a little bit better at packing lightly and left for home. We began a multi-day journey across the country and back to the place where I started practicing right after graduation. I literally went back to the same clinic and the same clinic owner. Part of me was relieved to be home, and part of me was wondering what that whirlwind trip through the States was all for. Why did I do it? Why could I not stay in one place, and why did I keep having these feelings of sadness and anxiety, and why was I not exercising anymore? The year was 2000. I was growing up and probably growing out a bit too. I had switched, as I mentioned, from beer to wine because that's so much more sophisticated. And besides, who's ever heard of wine belly? I decided it was time to start my own private practice. I partnered up with a couple of physiotherapists around the same age and stage of career as me, and at the start of the new millennium, we'd opened a new private practice. The fact that I had flunked out of business school might have been a sign that I wasn't really cut out for business, but buoyed by the fact that one of the three of us must have some skills in this, we ventured on. Owning a business is no easy road. My heart goes out to anybody who is a small business owner. It was high stress. I had a mortgage, and to go with meeting business and overhead responsibilities, that stress was killing me. I was diagnosed for the first time in my life with high blood pressure and told to lose some weight and cut back on the wine. For the first time in my life, my physical health had not only slid to affect me aesthetically, but clinically. I was scared. I was too out of shape to start running, so I decided to start walking and lifting weights. Within a week, my blood pressure actually had dropped, but my stressors never seemed to go away. It was 2003, and now I really needed a change. Fortuitously, a job came up at a local college to teach physiotherapist assistants. Thankfully, my recently obtained master's degree would open the door for me. I resigned from the ownership of my clinic and started full-time at the college. What a different life. There were stressors, of course, but nothing like the oppressive weight of not making your mortgage payment because you couldn't see enough patients to even make clinic overhead payments. Yep, you would think I would never be so silly as to try to owning a business again. Oh, but just stay tuned. I had been working at the college for a few years. When walking to work one day, I was struck like a bolt of lightning of the strongest metaphysical urge to have children. To this day, I cannot explain it, but I can tell you the exact spot on the sidewalk where it struck me over 16 years ago. I knew two things right away. Number one, this could not be ignored, and number two, how was I going to convince my partner of this? As I write this, I just celebrated with my daughter her 16th birthday, so I guess you know how that turned out. I also have a 13-year-old son, and spoiler alert, I have 4 stepchildren. I couldn't be more proud of all of them. Before I get to that, a few final parts to finish up this part of the history of the creation of how I became a glass chewer. So yes, my daughter was born in 2006, and I was over the moon. I had also recently fallen in love with teaching at the college and thought my days, for at least the third time in my career as a physiotherapist, were over, at least from a clinical perspective. I decided to start a PhD at Rutgers University in New Jersey. If you were to look at a map, you would see that Rutgers is a long ways from British Columbia. I had actually started to make connections to start this PhD while I was still living in Pennsylvania. I'd become fascinated with multiple sclerosis, and I was also fascinated with its unclear etiology or cause. I'd also become fascinated with electromagnetism and geomagnetism and wondered if there might be another model to help explain why people living in northern latitudes have a high prevalence of MS. I won't bore you with the details of my research, but suffice to say, I had embarked on a PhD in about 1999 with some coursework, and I officially defended that dissertation in 2012. Anyway, back to the desire to once again consider a career change. It was partway through my PhD around 2007 when I started to think about throwing myself into research and applying for research track positions at a local university. As with my realization about my shortcomings while preparing to write the MCAT, it became clear that I was 20 years behind and hundreds of publications shy of being a legitimate candidate for any job at the university. Once again, I realized that trying to change lanes that late in life, while not impossible, would require sacrifices I was just not willing to make. I realized that I had a great job at the college, and I was becoming more and more able to appreciate the profession that had given me so many opportunities. It was time I started to appreciate where I was, and with the birth of my son in 2008, I wanted to focus on my young family. I'd been working at the college for about 6 years, had 2 amazing children. It would have appeared from the outside that I was all set and on track for a stable ride into eventual retirement and the golden ages. Sure, I was still relatively young in 2008. I was only 38, but the typical track of the college professor kind of goes that way. Each year, largely the same, 2 terms broken up by Christmas holidays, a reading break in February, and a nice summer break. Wash, rinse, repeat. As you probably have gathered by my story, if you've made it this far, I don't usually stick with the status quo. I'm driven by passion, intuition, and instinct. I trust those qualities, and if I trust them, I'm usually fine. When I lead with ego, I get in trouble. Take, for example, thinking I'm some kind of natural businessman. Laughable, I know. You might think, well, it sounds like, Brett, you've learned your lesson. You'll never go into business again. Oh, my friends, just hang on. There it was, that niggling feeling that something wasn't quite right. I searched myself for what it could be. Great job, great kids, exercising a little more, drinking a little more wine than I should be, but not too bad. I won't get into all the details, but as I foreshadowed earlier, the major missing element for me, besides exercise, was love. Not the kind of love I had in abundance for my children, but that kind of reciprocal partner love that I needed all along, probably going back many decades. I will just say that I found it, and once discovered, there was nothing that was going to stop the union from happening. Disassembling 2 marriages and then reassembling a new one with 6 children is not a task for the faint of heart. When you know at a cellular level that this partner is for you, you do what it takes. I'd like to be able to tell you that it was smooth and easy, but of course that's not exactly the way it went. We came together and we were like gasoline to each other's flame. The energy actually was helpful for the process of combining 2 families while working full-time and in the throes of renovating new living spaces. We made it through those earlier years, and I'd like to think we did a pretty fair job, all things considered. The stress at times, though, was immense. Maybe the most stressful times of both our lives, for now. As things started to stabilize and our renovation slowed down, you would think we would take a step back and enjoy the fruits of our labor, but oh no. It was 2012 and I was just finishing a book I'd been working on called Akahi Method. We had just returned from New Jersey, where I successfully had defended my PhD. Having assessed the opportunities for me as a researcher at the university, as I previously mentioned, we decided to stay the course and find some stability in our lives. That lasted a couple of days. Soon our passions and my persuasiveness had us designing and planning to build a yoga studio. Wait, what? Yep, you heard me. I convinced my wife that I was a successful businessman. I know, I can be that persuasive. While yoga was not, at that time, my jam, my wife loved yoga, and of course I was a big fan of meditation. We decided to build a yoga studio with dedicated meditation classes, and the studio would be welcoming to everyone. We wanted a place where people would come and not feel judged, but accepted and hopefully learn something about themselves along the way. I somehow also managed to persuade a bank that I was a successful businessman, and they loaned us a bunch of money, of which was all spent on our beautiful yoga studio when we opened in 2014. We were broke right out of the gates and scared out of our wits. We were paying a mortgage, working full-time, raising kids, working many hours at a yoga studio, training to become yoga teachers, paying staff, teachers, paying overhead to a landlord, and each month we were drowning. I reassured my wife, hey, this is normal. We just need to double down on our efforts. After all, I was a businessman. After 1 year, we'd maxed out all our lines of credit and credit cards, and we were still nowhere near making money. We eventually hit on a few ideas that brought in some revenue, but despite all of our hard work and excellent feedback from loyal clients, we were dying. If I thought my stress was bad before this business, it was now redlining. I was too scared to even check my blood pressure. I had no time for exercise, so I reverted back to my bad habit of over-imbibing wine. We drank wine and cried most nights and wondered how much more we could take. All that we had worked to bring us together, and we were just destroying ourselves with a non-essential idea. We did eventually sell the business and narrowly avoided bankruptcy. We moved houses and vowed to slow down on the renovations. The year was 2019 and COVID hit. I was working 2 jobs, full-time as a college professor in the day and almost full-time in the evenings as a physiotherapist. It had been nearly 5 years since we left the yoga studio, and my wife and I were working like mad to bail us out of debt. When COVID hit, my physiotherapy income stopped. It seemed scary at first, but we had a lot of free time. We started walking regularly, and it seemed everyone was walking. Maybe you had that experience too. The more we walked, sometimes twice a day, the better we felt. I outfitted a home gym, I bought a trainer for my road bike, and eventually a treadmill. I started to feel better. The year was 2020. We were exercising regularly. I'd gone back to treating patients at night with some restrictions, of course. I decided to actually work less. I started to feel better. The year was 2021. I started jogging again. It hurt. Everywhere. But I kept on. I began to remember what this felt like. I ran 3 times a week. I rode a bike 4 times a week. I walked daily. And I meditated regularly. I did a yoga practice. I felt better. It was November 12th, 2021, not so long ago. I was feeling well enough to take off my shirt and stand in front of the mirror. I glanced over at the photo of me crossing the finish line of the 1990 Ironman Canada. I looked back to the guy in the mirror. I gently smiled and laughed a bit. My tummy jiggled. I bought a scale. And with great trepidation, I stepped on a scale for the first time since, in my early 20s. I was taken aback. I knew it was bad, but I guess I just needed to know for sure. On that day, November 12th, 2021, I realized that I was a glass chewer. I knew from my past experience in this life so far that there were many ways that I could deal with and have dealt with those strong mental, emotional feelings. Some would be helpful and others would not. Some took me away from what I knew was really, truly what I needed to do. March 4th, 2022. I've been running for 3 days a week. Some of my runs are nearing respectable distance and time. I ride a bike 4 days a week. I'm getting stronger. My pant size is shrinking, and I look okay-ish in Lycra. I step on the scale every Friday. I eat sensibly in small amounts. I'm feeling better. In fact, my weight is inversely related now to my level of happiness. I'm a glass chewer. If I don't chew glass, then I must run or bike or swim every day. No excuses. No exceptions. I'm 51 years of age, and my body won't take too many more backslides or inappropriate stress responses. I now must stay the course. I thank you for listening. I've never told that story in its entirety to anyone. Thank you for not judging me too harshly, and I'm doing my best, just like you. At least once a month on this show, Chewin Glass, I'll bring a guest, a fellow glass chewer, to interview for this podcast. As I mentioned, some of them will have strategies to deal with not chewing glass, like exercise, but some of them will be different. Maybe some of them will be artists, maybe writers. Maybe they just know walking or breathing or yoga. I hope you will consider signing up for this podcast and perhaps visiting my website to learn more about me at brettjwade.com. I look forward to connecting with you in the future. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to hearing from you. Peacefully, Brett. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chewin Glass, the podcast. I've been your host, Brett Wade. For more information about this podcast and other projects I'm involved with, visit brettjwade.com.